Hey everyone, it's Art Prof teaching artist Deepti Menon here, and I'm joined by Prof Lieu. This way. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today we are doing a stream called Animation Curriculum for Self-Taught Artists, which I am so excited for. If you are looking to strengthen and flex your art muscle, Art Prof is the community for you. We have tutorials, critiques, and more, and it's all for free. So Clara, why don't you get us started about this video we're doing?
Yeah, this is a stream that actually accompanies this Google Doc, which is an animation curriculum. And the link to this is in the YouTube video description below. So what you guys will find is this doc basically expands on what we talk about in the stream. We've links to specific resources, animation prompts, different ways you can structure your own self-study. So definitely check this out. And this is a part of a whole series of curriculums for self-taught artists. For example, we have 3 that cover the basics. We did one on illustration a few days ago. And next month, we're going to do one on comics. And yes, there will be more beyond that as well. Deepti, why don't you get us started by explaining some of these animation basic concepts. So let's start with movement, which is one of the concepts of animation and how that works.
Well, yes, movement is the easy one to start with because what animation is basically a moving image, but there is a lot more to it. You know, how an object moves tells us a lot about what that object is trying to say or make us feel. So movement is one of the big principles of, or key concepts in animation that really makes or breaks what you're looking at.
By the way, who remembers Ladybug Picnic? I really want to know. Did you ever see this on Sesame Street, Deepti?
No, I don't even know what this is.
Oh my God, I can totally sing the song from beginning to end. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But what I think is interesting about animation is the way that it really like burns into your brain when you see it as a child. Like this was one of your favorite films growing up, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think Nightmare Before Christmas was super informative to my art style and just loving animation. But it's really nicely paired with the skeleton dance because the movement, like in both of these, it's like they're both skeletons technically, and there's a lot more elements going into it, but like the way they move really speaks to what the character is and maybe the kind of like mood that we're looking at.
All right, now we've got timing, which I think is one of the trickier things in animation because I used to go to the Student Film Festival at RISD when I was there as an undergrad, and wow, you can tell who's good at this and who is not.
Yeah, I mean, timing is so important because timing can provide humor. If something is like the wrong timing from what we're used to seeing, it actually makes things really funny, or it can make you uncomfortable. It also helps create pace, and it creates the world and like relationships. But with movement comes timing. Like what you'll see is we're about to present a few concepts and they all kind of really come together to create a well-rounded animation or character. But timing is really important because if you change something's timing just a little bit, it really shifts our perception of what we're looking at. And you can use that to your benefit. You know, the point of animation is that it's not really real life. It absolutely isn't real life. So to stretch how things move in space and the timing can really like lend to your film being that much more exciting.
By the way, I would like to hear in the chat, how many of you guys have done animation? How many of you guys want to do it, but maybe like me, were too intimidated by the whole process? Although I've changed my mind after doing some of these tutorials with C. Lark Reese. And how many of you want to do it, but just don't know where to start? I'd love to hear where you guys are. Okay, let's talk about weight. This is the one that I sort of understand better.
Yes, I think you would be great at weight because you're always talking about mass and stuff.
Yes.
But yeah, so weight works with timing and movement because how much mass and weight something has. And also we have to think about gravity a little bit, like because in animation, your film can be anywhere in the world. But oftentimes it's like with the gravity that we all know, but weight with movement and timing really creates space. I mean, the way that the basketball was bouncing versus this falling paper versus how all the different elements of this Sally Cruikshank character is moving, you really have to take into consideration all of these things to make a believable character. And you want to keep that follow through throughout your whole film, because if your paper is falling in this nice way and then 10 minutes later it's falling like who is that, Wile E. Coyote, I think. Something obviously happened to your paper where it gained a lot of weight and now it's moving in space completely differently. So all of these things work together to create a believable object and a believable personality.
I definitely feel Deep D when I see a film and the weight isn't well done. It makes things look very floaty and they don't feel like they exist in the real world. Like I've seen the early Pixar animations, the figures look like they're just like floating. Like they don't actually look like they have any mass to them. So it's funny how much that influences the believability of the character.
Yeah. And the last one is personality, which is one of my favorite ones. And I think that all together, movement, timing, weight, and personality come together to create an interesting animated object. So this is from one music video that I did. And I put this one here because you can kind of see the weight of it in the way that it's squashing and stretching. The movement is obviously there. It's not just it's like really moving. The timing of how things are coming in and out. And together, all of those things create a personality for these basically inanimate little poopy objects on the floor. But then with characters too, the way you design, with color and line, all lends to personality. And with animation, personality is kind of like the most important part of it because you're like creating something from scratch. You're like a magician. And that's kind of where the awe and wonder comes in with animation. It's the personality. You're like, wow, look at this guy who's creepy, but then breaks apart.
Jennifer says, I have all these animation ideas in my head. Not executing them is a bit of intimidation mixed with where to start. Do you have any general advice, Deep D, for people that feel that way? Because I definitely feel that way. And it made me not want to learn it, actually, because I was so freaked out by how complicated it looks.
Yeah, I think the big thing with animation is that when you think about it, you're thinking about like Pixar or like a feature-length film. And if anyone's gone to my Instagram, I like to show off that you can create animation with just scrap paper and a pencil and an app on your iPhone. And we have tutorials on Art Prof, like with stop motion animation, where I teach you how to use these apps and how to just make, you can even use like a highlighter and move it around. And really trying to divorce yourself from the idea of it having to be something beautiful or amazing, and really just playing around with the concepts of movement, timing, weight, and personality. If you can like put your mind into those 4 things and just be like, well, that's all I want to figure out. I want to see how I can make this highlighter move interestingly. I want to see like what kind of personality this highlighter gets when I shoot it across the screen or when it's like inching. What if this highlighter bounced like a bouncy ball? Or what if it dropped like a brick and just had a little bit of ricochet? Trying like really simple things and, post it on Instagram or don't. Who cares? I think that's the best way to start off. And then you'll just start discovering, because we were talking about this earlier, Clara. We made this slideshow just the 2 of us, so it's like our brains on here. It's not the whole scope of animation. But I was having imposter syndrome making this because I was like, I'm a specific type of animator, but animation is so broad. There are so many things that it can cover. And so that's really overwhelming, but it's so broad because once you break it down into these 4 ideas, you learn so much and then you start experimenting and you'll figure out what you like. So all to say, don't worry about the end product, just play around and you'll discover what you like.
So let's look at walk cycles, because this is a really simple example of how those 4 concepts come together. And some of you guys might have seen, I think it was just Friday, that Cian taught me how to do a walk cycle in Procreate. So you guys can check out the stream. And look, I made a little steam bun. His name is Tsuki, and you can watch him run in my tutorial.
I love this steam bun. He is so excited. He's like a
Well,
baby.
I had him as a snack earlier that day.
Well, rest in peace, Zuki.
So, Deepti, is the walk cycle a good place to start?
It is. I think the walk cycle is great because you get there's an openness to it. You can create your own character, and you also just learn about the basics of movement. You can break it down to something really simple, like what we're seeing on the screen right now. But also, it's really good to just understand movement. And the walk cycle is, although it looks simple, it's actually quite complicated because there are a lot of different moving parts. There's the legs, there's the hands, there's how all of those things work together. So once you're ready to jump into something, honestly, I would say it honestly takes a little bit of time to get to a walk cycle, but clearly you did it, Claire, and you don't have a lot of animation experience. So, would you say that it was a simple place to start?
Well, it took a lot of hand holding from Cian. He was really like showing me every step. I actually found the bounce and squish a little bit easier, the bouncing ball, but maybe that's because it didn't have as many moving parts as the walk cycle. So actually, I'm glad we did the bounce before we did the walk cycle.
Yeah, I think just every animator takes things in their own stride. Like if you really want to work with characters, the walk cycle is inevitably something that you want to get to, but get to that point once you're ready.
Now, we are looking at what is known as the 12 principles of animation. Now, this might be a concept that you guys see online in tutorials and things like that. But Deepti, I didn't realize that this was really from Disney. Like I've seen this around. I thought, oh, well, that's just what it is. Can you explain this? Because we're going to cover some of these, but not all 12.
Yes. So these 12 principles of animation were presented by these Disney animators, Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas, in this book that they wrote in 1981 called The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation. And they're basically 12 principles, as the title says, of the key concepts of animation according to them. Now, I will say that this is according to Disney animators, and Disney animation is a very specific kind of animation that's very different than experimental animation. So they don't really apply to all kinds of animation, which is why I picked 3 that we're going to look into in a few minutes that I think are really useful for all kind of animators. But they're a great way of just understanding what goes into animating, because all of them really go into like why knowing about your arcs, number 7, is important for when there's a character or there's movement. What is appeal? What is staging? And all of those things are sometimes things that you don't think about when you're creating a character or a world. But going through them, I think it's actually really helpful. So regardless of what kind of animator you are, I actually did a refresher with them when we were creating this, because I am definitely, if you know my animation style, I do not follow any rules. But I think that they're actually very, very useful. But yeah, I will say caveat, they're based in this kind of Disney world.
So what we've done is we've distilled it down to 3 that we think are really essential. And then you guys can obviously go on and research the other ones. But I know that for me, I need it totally simplified, because I look at the 12, I go, oh my God, I don't know where to begin. So I'm actually really glad, Deepti, that you distilled it down to 3. So let's talk about squash and stretch.
So squash and stretch is one of my favorites because it just makes everything just so fun. And our tutorial on the ball bounce is, a great way to look at it. But I love this GIF that we're seeing by Chris Zachary, because you see the squash and stretch in different varieties here. Like the ball on the far left is really squashing and stretching as it's falling, and others. But you can see how showing the squash and stretch actually gives each one weight and personality also. But squash and stretch is just one of those principles that give a mass movement and weight in a really interesting and satisfying way. Seeing things squash and stretch might not be realistic, but it really creates that fun that is animation.
I had so much fun with this, and Cian really boiled it down to this diagram that made it so easy to do. So I really recommend that you guys take a look at this tutorial, because he made it so much easier. Now, of course, there's more advanced stuff. Like we're looking at this piece here by Nina Paley, and she actually did all these goddesses. So you guys can look at the whole series. And this is my favorite squash and stretch, Deepti, the mushrooms and Fantasia.
Oh, I love it. Because isn't that so much more appealing than just this like movement where there's no like bounce and jiggle? And it really is such a core concept in animation. You see it all the time. Now you'll just see it everywhere in anything. But it's so satisfying.
Next, we have exaggeration. I used to watch Popeye all the time. Like a lot of these cartoons are from my childhood. It was like really fun to revisit them. So what do we mean by exaggeration, Deepti?
So exaggeration is, as the word, kind of describes in and of itself, is to make things larger than life and to really pack a punch. Is that the saying? Pack a punch. But basically it's the core of animation, is that you're not watching a film, you're not watching a documentary, you're watching animation for a reason. And there are moments when exaggerating things can really send home a message or make the audience feel a certain way or create a comedic moment. And it's what creates that wow factor in animation. So you'll see exaggeration all over the place, and sometimes more often in like Looney Tunes or those kind of like cartoons. But what you're seeing on the screen is like a rotoscope animation that I did, where I drew over an actual video, but I exaggerated certain parts of it. As you can see, that's obviously not what my friend's face really looks like, but it does pack a punch to create this kind of scary character.
Wrigglesworth is saying the combination of creative burst and tedium really appeals to me. I really think animation, you have to have such an incredible amount of patience. But the thing is, the payoff, whoa, I am just blown away by that moment when you press export and it's like, oh my God, it's a magic trick. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's so satisfying. And like, it really, even a second of it can be so satisfying and so worth it.
Okay, anticipation. How would you describe this concept?
So anticipation is a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but it's that moment before an action. And it's really, you'll see it again a lot in animation, but it's, for example, this bully who's punching Popeye. There's a moment where he swings his arm back in anticipation for the punch. So instead of the punch just being an animation like that, where it's just going straight back and forth, there is a moment of anticipation, which gives that movement a really nice arc. And with Hades over here, it's really slight, but right before he lights his finger on fire, there's a moment of anticipation where he puts his hand back and then flicks it forward. So anticipation is a really nice tool in animation that can just add a sense of reality to it. Like, it almost makes it feel more real, and it makes it feel like more flowy. And it just makes your pieces really feel like it's coming together. It has such a nice satisfactory feeling to like watch something have a moment of anticipation and then do the action, rather than just like going from still to action.
I just love this little moment. This little creature on the right-hand side when it opens the mouth.
It's like an inhale before a sneeze. I think a sneeze is such a wonderful idea of anticipation, because it's like a instead of just going, there's like a, and it's also exaggeration in animation. Instead of just doing a sneeze might just be like achoo, but when you do it in animation, you can really make it a and pause and then let it out. And it's so satisfying.
All right, let's dig a little bit into animation history, because I think almost more than any art form, animation has changed so dramatically, so quickly. Like when I was in art school, my husband was an animation major at RISD. I mean, they were cutting film with razor blades and taping it together. And the computer animation was this program, they were like called Amigas. And so actually the way animation is taught today, light years from the way it was in the 90s. So I always think, Deepti, that that's a tough thing to deal with, because the technology is changing so fast.
The technology is really changing. But what I will say, like most mediums, but especially with animation, working traditionally and in these like really old forms, like even these phenactoscopes, how do you say that word? I don't know. That's actually work that animators do to this day. One thing I love about animation history is, even though it's from years and years ago, all of these old ways of working are still actually very alive and well by independent and experimental animators. And it's so fun because it's so easy to do now with the technology we have. But I think regardless of how scary and advanced the technology is going, it's all rooted in this. And you can still do this. And it's so exciting. And one thing I will say about the technology is like a lot of times you can learn that on a job, but learning the basics, which is all based in Muybridge and all of these like old tools, is so exciting and will really teach you the core skills that you need, even just to understand technically, so that you can be a really great, well-rounded animator.
I mean, Deepti, I hear a lot from art school students. They complain that, oh, we weren't taught enough about the software. But I feel like you said, it's changing so fast that by the time you graduate, chances are there's some update to Procreate that changed everything. So I think you're right that these principles are actually more critical to learn. Rita Root says, if we are a self-taught 2D animator, what should we include in our portfolio?
I think it goes back to what we say for all portfolios: include your best work regardless of what that is, to just show that you're an artist first and foremost. But with animation, I think actually core ideas like gesture drawing from life is really important, because you are creating a world essentially, and understanding the world you live in is really important for creating a brand new world. But I think things like walk cycles and just showing that you're interested in animation and experimenting. I mean, we'll show you, like, there's so much variety in animation, but a walk cycle is great. Doing a ball bounce is great. Those are like really basic. But if you look in our Google Doc, actually, we have some prompts for, like, you know, showing a leaf falling or a brick falling, showing that you understand weight, gravity, movement, timing. All of those things are really important.
So this is really cool work by Alexioff and Parker. They were, I believe, a husband and wife team, and they were early innovators. I mean, excuse me, I love these pieces because they almost feel like moving paintings. Like, a lot of us think about SpongeBob and like really clear-cut line art and flat colors. And I think it shows that animation can be very painterly, actually.
Yeah, it can be incredibly painterly. I mean, there's animators who work primarily with just sand or charcoal, or they work on the same, instead of drawing on a different sheet, they work on the same sheet, which gives it really nice movement. This artist is like one of the innovators of paper cut artist animation, and it's so beautiful. So yeah, I've said it a million times, but there's like such a variety of types of animation. I get so excited just talking about it because I'm like, oh my gosh, now I want to try cut paper.
Well, I mean, think about the setup that Lotte Reiniger had. I mean, you guys can see on the left-hand side, stop motion animation app sure is easier and a lot more compact than what they had to do. And I think it's really worth revisiting a lot of this history, because it's oftentimes stuff, it just doesn't get seen, but it's like all the cartoons that we watch today, they're all from this. Like, these are basically the ancestors of all of these animated shows. Like Emile Cole, I love this stuff. It's so simple, but it's fabulous.
I mean, I like this comment from Lisa that says, I just watched Lottie's work, still appealing. I mean, that's so true. It's like you're not exposed to these animators' work in just day-to-day life, because what you're watching is Paw Patrol or Bubble Guppies or like SpongeBob or the next Pixar film, which is all lovely, but this stuff is less mainstream, but it actually might inspire you. It's what happened to me when I was in college. I thought being an animator meant I had to work at Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon, which is great if you want to do that. But then after getting exposed to this art history, I was like, whoa, I could do this. And you realize that there is a market for that, and it's actually really exciting, and it makes learning a medium actually so much more exciting when you see something that you connect with and you feel is digestible and you can do that. I mean, looking at Emile Cole's work, it's definitely very impressive. But for me, the kind of animation that I do and the kind of work I do, the line work and stuff seems more digestible to me than looking at a Pixar film. And that is inspirational. I'm like, oh, okay, I can see this. I can see me doing this.
All right, so we've just gone over some concepts that are very specific to animation. However, there's a huge amount of crossover in terms of foundation skills. A lot of this is from our basics curriculum. But I think, Deepti, oftentimes what I've seen with animators or character designers, they'll say, well, I don't need to learn all that stuff because gesture drawing isn't going to matter because I'm drawing cartoons, or I don't need to learn how to draw figures or animals because I'm just going to exaggerate them. And I think that's a pretty common misconception. I think all this basic stuff is really helpful.
It's super helpful. And like, need I remind you, as an animator, you're not drawing something once, you're drawing it 500,000 times. So I would say it actually might be more, it really behooves you to really understand your basics so that you can exaggerate things and you can work with color in a smart way, because you're going to do it for a second for like an hour, like you're going to be doing it so many times. So really knowing your foundational skills, understanding color, because, God forbid you work on a 10-minute animation, then add your color, not really understanding color principles, and then it looks really bad and you've just spent a year of your life. Or, it's a lot of time. So knowing the basics, just because stuff is moving and it's not a still painting, doesn't make those basic principles any less important.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if you don't have the basic principles, it doesn't matter how good the animation is, right? Like if you've got a rotten color scheme or if you don't understand shape very well, I think what we're discovering is that none of these principles or ideas are more important than each other. It's really the combination, the intersection of those and how you balance them that is the most important. Humdera says, how to take those beginner ABC steps when studying animation, what tools or skills are needed? Well, we're going over some of the basic skills like color and line, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. But what about the tools, Deepti? Do you think people need to get into digital animation right away, or do you think that maybe hand-drawn is a better place to start?
I think in terms of accessibility and just understanding, for me, I learn in a very tactile way, and I think that helps a lot of people. I think working in a hand-drawn way is the best way to go about it. And I always say, try and make a flip book, because you don't even need a computer or an image capturing device to put it together. With a flip book, which hopefully we'll have a stream for that maybe in the near future where I can teach you guys. But with a flip book, you just layer the images and then you flip through it and you just see the animation right there in front of you. And it's so accessible and easy. So I would say that's a really great place to start. And then starting with, using your smartphone if you have one and taking images that way and being able to composite things digitally. But I would say as traditionally as you can, work that way, because animation feels so tactile to me. That I think learning it in that really hands-on way will help you when you transition into digital. But that's just my opinion.
Lisa H says, I recommend playing with simple animation action at the same time. Don't hold back, waiting for other skills to reach a higher level. I think that's great advice, because I oftentimes hear with painting, well, I need to learn how to paint realistically before I can start brainstorming. I don't think that's a good idea. I think you should keep the ideas fresh and moving, and there's no such thing as, well, I'm not allowed to do this until I do that.
Absolutely. My Instagram profile is like exactly what that is. It's like I'm making a music video that I'm spending 2 months every day doing, that's like so pristine. But my social media presence is me just like farting around. And that's because I'm just trying to build my skills. And I think it's so important. You might be working on a really interesting Shadowboxers-esque a la Jordan, character design that's so involved and so beautiful. But you also might just be playing around with how a highlighter can look like a noodle. And that's still teaching you something. So just like Lisa says, play around with the most simple stuff. And as long as you're playing, you're advancing and you're creating. And that's the most important thing.
Deepti, one of my favorite lessons that we have on Art Prof, and we do have a YouTube playlist called Animation Tutorials and Discussions, so you guys can check that out later. But the fact that you don't even need to draw, you can just get found objects. You can just take this cup and animate the cup walking across the table. So you don't even need to draw anything to animate, right?
You can use your body. You can just, take photos of yourself or your roommate or your cousin or whatever, lying on their stomach and moving an inch forward every time you take a photo, and it'll look like they're flying. on the floor. You know, it's so simple, it's so accessible to do, and people just don't talk about it enough. But yeah, we have some tutorials that hopefully will make it more accessible and easy, because it's so fun. Once you realize that there's really no stakes and it's really accessible, it's so, so, so fun.
So what about shape, Deep D? Why is this relevant to animation?
Well, I think it's like the basics of just art making, shape. You're, regardless of the fact that things are moving, you're still thinking about composition, and you're still thinking about shape relationships and how your eye is drawn to something. And yes, movement comes into play, but shape can create a really appealing composition. It can also draw you in, create space. So it's all of these basic concepts just in moving form. What would you say though, Clara, with shape? Because I know that that's something that you work with a lot in your, sculptural pieces too, but how do you see it working in animation?
Well, I think shape is oftentimes more simple than, say, form, where you have shading and lighting and things get a lot more complicated. And, you think about South Park, which I think it's done digitally now, but the original idea was that it looked like cut sheets of paper. I mean, it's basically like a moving collage. And I really like collage because collage is so concrete. Because if you're doing a drawing and you're like, oh, I want to move that tree over, you have to like erase it. You got to draw it again. Collage, you just move it. It's like really, really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So I find collage is a great way to learn about composition, about shape, and you can just take that concept and apply it directly to animation. Too Dame Cute says, any advice or tutorials on cutout and 2D bones animation?
Well, we have some animation tutorials on our YouTube channel on stop motion animation. And I think the basics that I teach you, although those are stop motion with like clay figures or just found objects, you can use all the tools and concepts that I'm telling you in those videos. We also have a charcoal animation tutorial that's great for 2D hand drawn. But although those are very specific in the tools that we're using, the concepts that I'm teaching you and the way to work with the program is applicable across whatever kind of, if you're using paper cutout or you're drawing by hand with graphite. And hopefully in the future, we'll have some more very specific ones as well. Fingers crossed.
Let's talk about line. I think line is hugely important in animation. And sometimes people don't think about it as much as shape, because shape is so clear and obvious, but line can be very expressive depending on how you use it.
Yeah, I mean, line can show a lot of energy and the movement. I mean, here the mouth, that's all about exaggeration, right? It goes from so small to so big, and the line weight and the eyebrow line weight, it all really speaks to this character and its personality. And Norman McLaren is completely different, but the line and the movement of the line and the pacing and timing, it adds so much energy and personality to these lines. How do you see line working in animation, Clara?
I mean, I think that it has a lot to do with articulation. Like this Norman McLaren piece, it really looks, I'm guessing that they like scratched heavily into something. So there's an aggressiveness to this line, which is rather gritty, but then like this is so fluid and it almost looks like you're pouring water around. And so I do think that the type of line that you're using does influence the feeling of the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a comment here that says, for hand-drawn animation on traditional, what tools should we have to get started? Is getting a light box worth it? I would say that a light box is definitely very helpful, but if you don't have a light box, you can actually just use your window and use natural light and tape up your animations, or find alternative ways. Use tracing paper instead of real paper. It actually gives it a kind of cool texture when you end up shooting it. So a light box is definitely helpful and will open up what you can use, but don't feel like if you don't have a light box, you can't animate, because you absolutely can. And sometimes, even if you're not using a reference, I like to sometimes just draw every frame by like looking at the other frame, but not placing it underneath a light box, and trying to see what happens if I like kind of use the reference. It's fun. I mean, if you don't have a light box, what I'm trying to say is don't feel like you can't do something because you don't have a tool. You can absolutely do it.
And Deep, one thing I learned from you is that animation doesn't have to be neat and finished. It can be sloppy and fast. And sometimes that's the better way to wrap your head around the concept, because then you're not nitpicking every single frame and trying to make it look perfect. So that's why you guys should all look at Deep's Instagram, because there's so many just like quick pieces that are not hyper perfect and resolved that I find very inspiring for that reason.
Yeah, and they teach you about energy, and it also just makes things less complicated, and you learn so much. Like, even if it's not looking great and you don't want to put it in your final piece, the process and watching it back will give you some inspiration and aha moments. So don't worry about making things look as beautiful as Song of the Sea.
Deep, why are animals important for animation?
Well, the wonderful thing about animation and animals is that animals come to life. Like, animation is one of those worlds in which animals are just as important. I mean, they are important, but like they have just as much weight as like a human being does in a live action film. They can talk, they can have a job, they can walk, So animals really take a whole new personality and have whole new meaning in animated films. And Studio Ghibli is like one of the, masters of creating really interesting animated animals.
Jaden is asking, is a pegboard worth it? Because I might be able to hold the paper down with my hand and flip the pages. So can you explain what a pegboard is? Because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Yeah, so you can buy just a peg bar, and a peg bar is this bar that has a very specific hole punch coming out of it, and you can buy animation paper that has that exact hole punch, and when you put the paper down on the peg bar, it holds it down, and then every time you put a paper down in the peg bar, it aligns it perfectly. So you know that your paper is aligned perfectly every time you put down a new frame. Yes, I think it's the same answer with the light box. I think a peg bar helps, but I have never used a peg bar for anything that you see on my animation. I will just put 2 pieces of tape like this on a corner, 90-degree angle, and shove my paper in that corner so that it fits perfectly, and just make sure that every time I put a new piece of paper down, it's in that corner perfectly. And I don't mind a little bit of chatter and a little bit of, movement in my animation. I actually like that. So if you don't have a peg bar, don't worry about it. Figure out another way to register your paper. It's not very hard, but if you do, that's awesome, and that'll make your life a little bit easier.
So Deep, a lot of people don't realize that actually doing gesture drawings from human figures is a huge skill in animation. In fact, when I was at RISD as an undergrad, there were like these Disney guys, and they would go to every single life drawing session on campus. They used to have it like twice a week, and it was free. You could go anytime you wanted. And they'd always be like, okay, let's do 30-second gestures. Like, I could not get them to draw anything longer than 2 minutes. Why is this so critical for an animator to learn this?
Well, understanding the human body is so critical, because if you're creating characters and exaggerating them, you need to understand what an actual human body looks like so that you can squash and stretch and make it look like it's an actual human body moving. But also, you're drawing, like for a Disney film, you're drawing Cinderella moving around for thousands and thousands and thousands of frames. You're really going to have to know how to work quickly and draw that body realistically. So doing figure drawings in a really quick motion and understanding the body and how it moves, what it can and cannot do, is so important for an animator, because you're moving so quickly when you're animating. So you really need to know that foundational skill of a human body and how those joints work and move. You're doing a walk cycle. You need to know that your arm can only go like this and it can't bend the other way, because if you're doing a walk cycle and it's bending the other way, it's going to look weird.
Dara is asking, is it possible to get a good job as a self-taught animator, or is it an area where school is really encouraged and or required?
Yes, I think it's easy to get a job as a self-taught animator. Your portfolio is what speaks the loudest, and your work ethic and you being a kind person. But I think that going to school helps in the sense that you get networking opportunities and have a community that you might not, but it's absolutely possible as a self-taught artist. Your portfolio, if it's up to par and it's showing something innovative and is for what that company or show is looking for, 100% you can get a job. Don't let school hold you back.
So obviously there's a lot of human figures and lots of animated films, and a lot of them are quite specific in terms of the stylization and the characters. But I think what we're trying to say is that that foundation of gesture drawing lets you do crazy stuff like this, which just blows my mind. So it's sort of like if you have that foundation, you can push it in any direction you want. Like we just did yesterday, the stream on how to sculpt a face. That could become an animation. And obviously the skeleton is part of the human figure as well. But I think with the human figure, oftentimes people, they get very overwhelmed by the anatomy. So do you think anatomy is important, Deepti?
I do think anatomy is important because you want to understand the basic human anatomy in order to manipulate it. I think Pixar is a great example of how the body is really not that complicated. They use a lot of square shapes and circular shapes, but you still have to understand how those things move, because if you're going to distill it down to something so simple, it still has to have specificity in how it moves so that it's believable. And Pixar does a really great job of creating that. So I do think that the basics of anatomy is just useful for artists in general. And at the end of the day, an animator is an artist. So yes, I would say that studying anatomy is very crucial and a really good idea.
Ahmed is saying, what kind of paint can you use on cells? Can you explain what a cell is in case people don't know?
Yeah, so a cell in its basic form is just a frame of an animation. But I think what they're specifying is like a cell is like in the original SpongeBob or a lot of the shows you see, the image that you're seeing is actually layers, like 3 or 4 layers. There's a background cell that's painted that's often used for multiple seconds. And then there's the cell of like SpongeBob. And it's all clear, like plastic, I think, or it's a certain type of like plasticky clear material. And that you paint on. And the paint that I believe people use is gouache on cells of like a TV show animation. Yeah.
Cool. Let's talk about lighting. How does this affect animation, Deepti?
Well, it creates a believable world, lighting. You know, if you want your world to be something a little bit realistic, lighting is super important to create shadows, create mass, make the background and foreground and character feel like they all exist in the same space. But also, if you're doing something a little bit more flat and graphic, lighting still can help with creating space and depth and create interesting illusions and aha moments. So just like in a painting, it's really important in creating space and mass and making a believable space. It works the exact same way.
I think lighting is very important as a storytelling tool because lighting oftentimes, it really sets the mood. Like this is one of my favorite moments in Spirited Away, you know, when the sun starts going down and then Haku is like, get out of here, otherwise you're going to come to the spirit world. And this is such a magical moment in that movie. And a big part of it is the sun going down, it becoming very dark, and just the atmosphere totally changes. And we do have a series of videos where we explain how shadows work, how highlights function. So I recommend those videos. Backgrounds. Hugely important for animation to establish a context. And sometimes people don't want to deal with backgrounds, but they're so important.
They're so important. And look at how satisfying it is to have this background in Akira. I mean, the movement of these motorcycles and the light trails and everything is so satisfying. But if we didn't have that background, it really would change how we, experience this and how we understand this world. Backgrounds are so important, and they actually sometimes are just nice to do because you don't actually have to animate the background all the time because it's sometimes a still image, but it creates depth as well, and it creates space, and it creates feeling. So just like, when we're talking about a self-portrait and we're like, do a background, don't just color it in. It really is such an important tool in the narrative storytelling part of animation. And you're creating a film or an animation, there is a story there. So use your background to help you.
There's a great comment from Jaden who says, yes, the backgrounds are literally the world. And that's basically what you're doing when you're an animator, is you're creating a world. And that world is all background. So it's a huge part of creating that stuff. By the way, this Google slideshow, it is available. Sometimes it's easier for you guys to review the slides. Use it in conjunction with the curriculum, which is this Google Doc. Links to both of them are in the video description below, so you guys can check that out. And we do have an Art Prof Share today. Art Prof Share is where you guys create artwork in response to one of our video tutorials. So today the Art Prof Share is from Alexandra Darling. And Alexandra explains that they spent their childhood in a small town in Eastern Europe in the 90s, quite some years after communism fell, and that their mother was struggling to find good children's books for them, which were rare at the time. And so Alexandra watched the stream we did about Ezra Jack Keats, who's a very famous children's book illustrator. And Alexandra says that the illustrations, particularly this one, reminded them of their childhood, even though the settings are completely different. And so what Alexandra ended up doing was this image of time with their cousin at their grandparents' house, getting into all kinds of mischief. They found a beat-up mattress, took the springs out, tied them to their feet, made them jump super. I mean, it's a great story. I just love that. And so Alexandra explains that their illustration really was like an homage to this illustration by Keats. And certainly you guys can see the connection between the composition, but really this is like Alexandra's own take. It was done in gouache. And so they're really excited to do collage. So what do you think about Alexandra's piece, Deepti?
Oh man, I love it. I think it has such a story, like the expressions, the way the hair is moving up, and it works actually so well with our animation tutorial because there's like movement, personality, there's like even timing. I feel like there's timing the way she's like launching off the ground, but you're working so well with color and patterns and just creating really interesting characters. I'm so excited to see you work in collage because the way you're addressing the patterns in the dress and the curtains is already kind of alluding to collage. But this is so great. I'm so happy that you were inspired by one of our videos and created this like homage. It works so well, but is also so unique and new. I really can't wait to see more.
What I really like about this piece, Deepti, is that you notice the springs on the kids first, and then you're like, why? And then you notice the mattress on the lower right-hand corner. And I love that the mattress is not all there. Like it's mostly cropped, but you see enough to realize, oh, okay, it's a beat up mattress, but the emphasis of the illustration is still on the kids. Yes. So it's a beautifully told story. I love how specific it is, that it's in Eastern Europe. I love the pattern on the curtains. It's such a beautiful piece, Alexandra. So we hope to see more from you because I just think it's beautifully done. If you guys want to be considered for an Art Prof Share, you can go to artprof.org, click on tutorials. There is a purple button which takes you to a submission form because we love seeing what you guys are creating. And you can also show us on Instagram, just tag us and use hashtag ArtProfShare. Art Prof has a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. And in a few minutes, Deepti and I will be hanging out in the Art Prof Discord. We will be in the post live streams channel, so you guys can chat more about animation and ask Deepti all of your questions. Subscribe to our channel so you can continue to grow and develop as an artist. And thank you so much to our top Patreon supporters. Look at how many names there are. It's so exciting. There's so many that we have a second slide. I know I keep saying this, but I'm just like amazed that so many of you guys are helping us out so we can keep providing 100% free content. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.